China is Iran's economic lifeline. It buys the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports, tens of billions of dollars a year. And yet, China itself is one of the largest recipients of oil that flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that carefully. China keeps Iran's economy alive, and Iran closing Hormuz would hurt China more than almost anyone else. So, what exactly is China's game here? The answer tells you everything about how the global system actually works. Now, let's establish the scale because the numbers here are staggering every time this scenario plays out. China is the world's largest oil importer. It produces almost 5 million barrels of crude oil per day, but consumes more than 3 times that amount. The gap between what China makes and what it needs is enormous, and a massive chunk of what fills that gap flows through one narrow passage. About 45% of China's oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and that has been a long-standing strategic concern for Beijing. China, India, Japan, South Korea combined account for 69% of all Hormuz crude oil flows. But China is the biggest piece of that puzzle. And unlike Japan or South Korea, China isn't just a passive consumer. China has cards to play. Here is where China's situation diverges sharply from Japan's. And this divergence is structural, not accidental. China has been stockpiling, aggressively, for decades. The combined volume of China's strategic petroleum reserve and commercial stocks provides at least 200 days of crude oil import coverage. That's 50 days less of what Japan holds, but it buys Beijing some time that most other Asian nations simply don't have. China's strategic and commercial reserves now stand between 1.2 billion and 1.3 billion barrels. This wasn't market opportunism, it was deliberate crisis preparation. Beijing understood this scenario decades before it materialized. And there's a second layer in this game. Russia has surpassed Saudi Arabia as China's #1 source of crude, accounting for about 18% of imports. Pipeline oil from Russia doesn't pass through Hormuz. It doesn't pass through any choke point Iran controls. China has a cushion and a diversified supply that Japan simply doesn't have. And something else entirely, diplomatic leverage. This is the part that gets glossed over every single time this crisis cycle repeats. China accounts for over 90% of Iran's oil exports, tens of billions of dollars annually. Iran doesn't have another buyer at that scale. There is no alternative market. China is Iran's economic oxygen, which means Beijing can pick up the phone and say, "Don't close the strait." Never. And we know this happens. China presses Iran to avoid disrupting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, particularly energy exports from Qatar. Senior executives at Chinese state-owned gas firms, briefed by government officials, confirmed Beijing urged Iranian counterparts not to target oil and LNG tankers transiting the waterway. Publicly, Beijing stays neutral, but diplomatically, it works back channels. But here is the structural tension that never goes away, no matter which year this plays out. Chinese doctrine keeps Beijing in wait-and-see posture, avoiding direct involvement unless absolutely necessary. China doesn't want to be seen taking Washington's side. It doesn't want to weaken Iran too much. Iran is a counterweight to US power in the region, but it also cannot afford a closed strait. 3 competing interests, no clean resolution, every single time. If Hormuz closes and diplomacy fails, China would need to compete for Atlantic cargoes. If the outage persists, tightening the Pacific basin and intensifying price competition across Asia. Over land, pipelines like the Power of Siberia offer a more predictable, though less flexible alternative. But pipelines take years to expand capacity. They can't surge overnight, and the math on bypasses never changes. Saudi and UAE bypass pipelines combined could divert only around 2.6 million barrels per day, compared to 20 million that normally flow through the Hormuz daily. The gap cannot be closed, not quickly, not completely. In the Middle East crisis, Japan is a hostage and China is a player. But a player with real exposure and a fundamental constraint it can never fully escape. The one country with the most leverage over Iran is also one of the countries that needs Hormuz open most desperately. That paradox doesn't change with administrations or treaties or technology. It's baked into the geography. China's choice is never between winning and losing. It's between how much it's willing to spend in political capital, in economic exposure, in strategic clarity to quietly keep the lights on, without showing its hand to Washington, without abandoning Tehran. This is the permanent condition of Chinese power in the Gulf: sophisticated, constrained, and never fully resolved.